Today's topic is going to be a bit serious, and I do apologize for the upbeat background music you're hearing right now. Try to ignore it as we pay tribute to another recently deceased, or about to be recently deceased, television game machine. Today we'll be Googleizing Nintendo's little console that could, but in the end, couldn't. The Wii U. That's on today's somber episode of Rowan and Martin's Laughing.
Nintendo.
It's for breakfast now.
Nintendo.
It's a cereal. Wow.
Complete disclosure here. I am a self-proclaimed Nintendo fanboy, especially when it comes to its classic roster of characters. Mario, Green Mario, whatever you named your save file, Zelda, Justin Bailey, this f***ing guy, and the pink testicle. That being said, I will openly admit that for me, and possibly anyone with more than a casual interest in video games, Nintendo hardware hasn't risen above the status of supplemental game console for 2 decades now.
I'm in line too, because the director of 2020 said, "Stossel, I hate to ask, but you've got to help me get my kid a copy of Super Mario Bros. 2.
In order to appreciate the gravity of the situation that Nintendo finds itself in, we have to go back to the beginning. The original Nintendo Entertainment System, released in 1985 here in the States, was practically synonymous with video games for quite some time. If someone was playfully maneuvering sprites, it's a safe bet it was being done on the NES. The console played host to a majority of the late 80s and early 90s hottest games. This was thanks not only to the hardware's runaway success, but also Nintendo's strict, bordering on evil, licensee agreements. With rare exceptions, any games published on Nintendo's box wasn't allowed on the competitor's hardware. But hey, whatever worked, I suppose.
Words can't describe the endless challenge of Super Mario World, so we let the players do the talking.
When Nintendo introduced the Super NES in 1991, it started strong and kept the momentum going throughout its life. Sure, Big N loyalists missed out on coked-up hedgehogs and magic-spewing pop sensations, but in return they got some of the most beautifully detailed graphics and sound, bringing life to a seemingly never-ending assortment of quality titles. And who didn't appreciate the gratuitous sprite scaling, rotating, and faux 3D thanks to what's most famously referred to as Mode 7? By the mid-90s, the shrewd Nintendo began to falter. CD-ROM storage was beginning to show that it's not just cheesy acting and editing crisscross music videos. But that didn't sway Nintendo's decision to continue on with the expensive cartridge format for their new Nintendo 64 console, released in 1996. Many third parties who found greater profits free from the cost of EEPROMs embraced the competitor's hardware, all of whom used inexpensive discs for software. For the first time, Nintendo's library suffered. Sure, it had your Ocarina and GoldenEye and Rogue Squadron, but pledging loyalty to only the 64 and forsaking Sony's sleek new PlayStation around this time meant missing out on way too many classics. And the bang gamers got for their buck with cheaper CD-based games was too hard to ignore. Nintendo's GameCube, released in 2001, suffered for Nintendo's earlier decisions. While they finally made the switch over to optical disc media, adorably and infuriatingly smaller than the standard 5 inches, many third parties had already found better success over at Sony's camp with their wildly successful PlayStation and PlayStation 2 consoles. Some even decided to embrace Microsoft's freshman entry into the cutthroat home console market. But at least it could do this really cool thing. Once it was time for a new generation of consoles to emerge, Nintendo realized they were running the risk of becoming irrelevant. It was time to think outside the box.
We would like to play.
With this philosophy, they introduced the Wii in 2006, along with a novel new way of playing. Move your hand around. Actually, it's not that new. Remember the Power Glove?
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
Nonetheless, the product piqued the curiosity of the public at large, leaving the console a hard-to-find commodity well into 2007. While graphically inferior to the new Sony and Microsoft consoles, it was barely above the GameCube in the graphics department, The idea that everyone can embrace these new, easier-to-control, casual-friendly games would more than make up for it. Sure, on paper, the Wii was the leader in console sales of that generation, but it soon became evident that a lot of people were content using the console to bowl with their grandparents and little else. And while the console had quite a few solid offerings, many of them were marred by Nintendo's insistence on tacking on motion controls, even though they would have played much better without them. Worse still was the fact that many high-profile titles that ran swimmingly on the PS3 and Xbox 360 were simply impossible on the Wii's underpowered hardware, at least not without scaling it down. That brings us to the Wii U. Released in 2012, the console was destined to address all the shortcomings of its predecessors: HD graphics, better online support, and less reliance on waggle. But in place of one gimmick came another: the Wii U gamepad. Sure, it could do some cool things like act as a constant subscreen or allow for off-screen play as if it were a handheld, but as its predecessor was a console with many gizmos, nunchucks, wheels, plastic musical instruments, balance boards, and since much of the pre-release hype focused on the gamepad, it's easy to see why the uninitiated would mistake it as another add-on instead of one part of an entirely new console. And that's just one of the possible reasons offered for the console's poor showing. As of the date of this video, the Wii U sits at the bottom as Nintendo's worst-selling piece of hardware, not including the Virtual Boy. For reference, its predecessor sold 101 million units throughout its life. Even the GameCube, a console that finished dead last in this generation, managed to move almost 22 million units. And the name, Wii U, I get it, but at the same time, I don't. Wii U. While I figure they were using name recognition, nothing about tacking on a U implies a new console. And the fact that very often you needed to keep around Wiimotes to enjoy all of the games on the console's deluxe edition pack-in, Nintendo Land, may have led some to believe that it was not unlike Nintendo's DSi update to the original DS. Some new bells and whistles, but the same underlying hardware playing all the same software. Of course, many consumers were fully aware the Wii U was a new console and not just an updated Wii. They just didn't care. Nintendo has a bit of a poor reputation with some controller jockeys. It's quite possible they embraced the original Wii for the novelty, but even with some noteworthy titles, the library was weighed down by a glut of shovelware, most of which was of dubious quality. Thinking the Wii U would have been just more of the same was not at all unreasonable. Wow, I'm really saying a lot of bad things about the Wii U. Probably should look up the definition of eulogy when I'm done here. Finally, the Wii U's tepid sales meant that many third parties paid it little to no mind. So once again, anyone wanting to experience as many of the latest games as possible won't be depending on the Wii U as their only game outlet. It's easy to see why many just chose to ignore it altogether. But that's kind of a shame, because the Wii U is actually a very good console. Sure, it won't sit anywhere near the top of all-time great systems, and I will admit it isn't for every taste out there, but it offers up plenty of entertainment. Their port of Shovel Knight is one of the strongest, since the gamepad screen allows for on-the-fly switching of relics. Super Mario 3D World is probably one of the best Mario platformers in a long time. Splatoon is a great online squad-based shooter that can be enjoyed without having to listen to some prepubescent little snot say unkind things about your skills and or mother. I'm scratching the surface here, by the way. Bayonetta 2, Mario Kart 8, Super Mario Maker, Super Smash Bros., Yoshi's Woolly World. These are all excellent titles that alone give the Wii U a substantial library that can keep you busy for a good amount of time. And go back and revisit those easily overlooked but worthwhile Wii titles as well. They work just fine on the Wii U. Mad World, No More Heroes, Kirby's Epic Yarn, the Metroid Prime trilogy, the Super Mario Galaxy titles, Skyward Sword, just to name a few. And of course, there's a solid selection of retro titles on their Virtual Console if you feel like going old school without having to hook up old hardware. That's not the route I chose, obviously. At any rate, with the Wii U becoming a legacy console, you could find great deals on systems and software. I think it's worth investing in it just for the titles I mentioned, but it's still best utilized as a supplemental game console. You still want to keep a PlayStation 3 and or 4 around because Grand Theft Auto 5 or any of the entries in the excellent Uncharted series is good for washing all those cute Nintendo colors out of your eyes. Meanwhile, what does the underperformance of the Wii U mean for the business side of Nintendo? Despite a slump in profits, they're still a fairly healthy company. Surely they'll re-examine their missteps and apply that hard-earned wisdom towards their next endeavor. Maybe this time they'll focus on getting fans excited with solid, exclusive launch titles and a steady stream of impressive releases, with full support from several highly regarded third parties, instead of attempting to sell hardware on the back of some gimmick. Sigh. This was Dave for TeeVee Games. Like, comment, subscribe, and see you next time.
Nintendo.
It's for breakfast now.
Nintendo.
It's a cereal. Wow.
Nintendo.
Super Mario jumps
Nintendo.
in a fruit flavored crunch.
Nintendo.
Here's Zelda too.
Nintendo.
It's very good news.
Nintendo.
It's for breakfast now.
Nintendo.
It's a cereal. Wow.
Nintendo.
Super Mario jumps
Nintendo.
in a fruit flavored crunch.
Nintendo.
Here's Zelda too.
Yeah, well, just keep your power gloves off her, pal.